Welcome to Feminism and its Discontents. I'm Cecily Fiadh-Fernandez. This series is an opportunity to challenge the orthodoxy of the feminist movement with women whose views are often ignored by the mainstream media. In this episode, we'll discuss gender ideology and the new doctrine among the women's movement that trans women are women, and those that disagree are transphobic and hateful. How did we get here? And what are the implications of an ideology that posits that men and women are interchangeable? Those are some of the questions I'll be discussing with my guest, Dr. Mahri Irvine, who serves as the executive director of the Women's Liberation Front, or WoLF. Mahri, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Cecily, for having me. I'm really excited and pleased and humbled to be here today representing all of the women of WoLF.
Very happy to have you. Let's start, if you will, by telling me a little bit about your background and how you came to your position with WoLF.
Yeah, sure. I think that I've always been a lifelong feminist. Ever since I was a young girl, I actually grew up without electricity and television for the formative years of my life. And so my parents basically let me read, just about any book I could get my hands on. And so my natural tendency was to find a lot of books and read a lot of books about women and girls who were fighting various battles or inequalities, along with other really important issues like racism and things like that. So ever since I was just a young kid, I was always drawn to issues related to feminism. And my first year in college, I became a volunteer with a rape crisis center. So at the age of 18, that's basically when I launched what would become my career in the anti-sexual violence movement. And I'd been lucky most of my life to have not suffered too much at the hands of males. Although there were a few incidents, but my training as a rape crisis victim advocate really opened my eyes to the suffering of women and girls, particularly at the hands of men and boys. So I became, just very much more interested as the years went by in exploring feminism and really identifying as a feminist. I have a background in academia. I have a PhD in anthropology. And so I used to be really well-read with feminist theories, although as the years have gone by, I'm not quite as, quick to come up with the names of theorists. But, in terms of sort of my philosophical perspectives of feminism, if I had to label myself as a certain type of feminist, what I would call myself is a socialist feminist. And what that is that basically means, and I joke because now I feel like a capitalist due to my last job doing grant management. But basically what socialist feminism argues in a nutshell is that women can never truly be free of oppression until we have dismantled both the patriarchy as well as capitalism. So I've just always been really interested in looking at the intersections of class-based oppressions and poverty and how poverty affects women. That just, women of secure financial status have very different experiences as they go through their lives compared to women who are impoverished or who are struggling to survive. So that's sort of always been my theoretical interest.
Well, I find that so fascinating. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this series is because I come from a very different point of view politically. And I've always shied away from the label of feminist. And I don't actually agree with a lot of the orthodoxy around the idea of a patriarchy and wage gap, et cetera. So obviously I don't fit into today's women's movement, but given your background, not so long ago, you would have fit very well into mainstream feminist organizations. But obviously things have changed dramatically, and we'll get into a lot of that. But why don't we start with you telling me about your organization, WoLF, and its mission?
Yeah, definitely. And I myself only discovered WoLF a handful of years ago, maybe, 5 years ago at this point. And I stumbled upon them back when I was on Twitter, which I have since gotten off of because Twitter is not so great for mental health, in my opinion. And so when I discovered WoLF, I loved them because they really checked every single box of what I felt real feminism was. So the Women's Liberation Front is our nation's largest radical feminist, nonpartisan nonprofit agency. And we focus on protecting women's rights through legal work and legal advocacy through every single level of government. So that's federal government, as well as state government in all 50 states, as well as local government issues if people ask us to get involved. And our mission is very straightforward, but requires a lot of work. So WoLF's mission is to protect, advance, and restore the rights of women and girls through legal argument, policy advocacy, and public education. And we have 4 distinct focus areas that represent, our core values as radical feminists, but we primarily focus on just one of them, which is the bulk of what you and I are going to probably talk about today. So our 4 focus areas at WoLF are abolishing gender ideology. And gender ideology is a fancy way of saying sex stereotypes, right? Very regressive ideas about what men and women are supposed to be like. So we want to abolish gender ideology. We want to abolish male violence, which for us refers to sexual violence and domestic violence. We also want to abolish commercial sexual exploitation, which some people refer to as prostitution, and I often use the word prostitution instead. And our 4th focus area is we want to achieve women's full reproductive autonomy. So they have complete control over, their reproductive systems. But primarily, I'd say to this point in time, especially the past couple of years, a good 95% of all of our time and effort has been spent on abolishing gender ideology.
And I noticed from looking at the website that another big focus at WoLF is supporting sex segregation.
Yes, and we definitely, we're trying to abolish these regressive ideas about what men and women are supposed to be like. But at the same time, we actually think it's really important to not say that men and women are totally exactly the same in every way, and therefore they should be treated exactly the same way in every way. And so we actually really, really support in certain situations, sex segregated spaces and opportunities. So we believe that the only people who are being locked up in a women's prison or jail should be women. We don't think any men, which means males, should be locked in a women's prison. We support single-sex sports and athletic competitions. So we want to make sure that only women and girls are playing on sports teams or in competitions against other women and girls. And of course, if somebody wanted to create a third opportunity for athletics that was mixed sex, then sure, women could go compete against men if they wanted to. But, in terms of lockers and bathrooms and things like that, we feel very strongly that women and girls have very valid reasons for having those sex segregated spaces. And so when we talk about part of our mission is restoring women's rights, what we've been seeing over the past few years is the federal government and some state governments coming in and basically saying, women, you're not allowed to have single sex spaces anymore. We are going to legally allow men and boys to come into those spaces that historically have always been set aside for very good reasons, just for women and girls.
And can you tell me how you personally came to that view? And I ask that because those specific ideas really set you apart from other national feminist organizations.
Yeah, definitely. And I also wanted to mention in my description of WoLF, I really want to emphasize to everybody, watching your show that we are a true nonpartisan organization. We represent women across the United States of every political affiliation. So some of our members and supporters, they would describe themselves as Democrats, others would describe themselves as Republicans. Many of them say that they are just politically independent. They don't have an affiliation at all. And that's because they feel like they've either always been independent or they're women like me who over the years have said, neither one of the major parties in the US represents my viewpoints at all. And this issue related to gender ideology, I think, is what has driven a lot of women away from liberal, left, however you want to describe it, the Democratic Party, and it has driven women over towards WoLF because we're really the only agency in the country who is nonpartisan, but also based on feminist values. And so both personally, as well as I think it's fair to say for all of WoLF, we support sex segregated spaces particularly any spaces where women are going to be really vulnerable in terms of, their bodies or their privacy. So, we believe that if a woman needs to go see a doctor, it would be great if she could see a female doctor. If she had, she has some trauma-informed reason for wanting to see a female doctor, particularly if a doctor is going to be examining her genitalia, right? If she needs to go have a gynecological exam or something like that. And, a core reason that we think it's so important for women and girls to experience protected single-sex spaces is because the reality of sexual violence and domestic violence inflicted against women and girls by men is a huge reality in this country. A few years back, a report came out, I forget the name of the institution that released it, but they interviewed over 500 experts on violence around the world, and they were ranking all of the countries in the world based on the level of danger for women and violence against women. And a lot of people don't realize this because we want to believe like the US is the best, right? We're a great country. But this report found that the United States is ranked by these experts as the 10th most dangerous country in the world for women. And that's because we have mind-bogglingly high rates of domestic violence and sexual violence and stalking. And for all of the women in the United States, the CDC reports about 50% of all women have experienced what they refer to as contact sexual violence, which means that a perpetrator actually physically, put his hands or another body part on the woman. So there was physical contact made of a sexual nature. That's 1 out of every 2 women in this country. Statistically speaking, around the world, 1 out of every 3 women is a survivor of either domestic violence or sexual violence. And often that sexual assault is being committed when they're just girls. So they haven't even hit 18 years of age yet. And so not only are women victimized at very high rates, but the vast majority of the people who are hurting them are men. And so when we think of it like that, we know, of course, that not all men are perpetrators. And there are many wonderful, caring, loving men in this country who care deeply about women and girls. But the sad reality for women and girls is we're constantly doing a risk assessment. Every time we go to the grocery store, we go out jogging. I love to go hiking, and I have a level of fear about going hiking by myself, right? Because I don't want to be on a trail if a man comes towards me. So we're always doing a risk assessment. And so because we're living in a violent society, and you just look at the crime data to support that argument. So if as a woman, then I'm going into a bathroom and a man is legally allowed to be in the bathroom, my risk assessment is going to be messed up because I don't know now, should I be on high alert because there's a man coming into the stall next to me? Or should I just think, oh, he's just a normal guy who, isn't going to be a sexual predator? How am I even going to be able to know that or assess my level of risk? And, we've got reports now of, mixed sex bathrooms for kids and schools and things like that. And the UK is also having a lot of the same problems the United States are. And I have read stories from parents over there who say their daughters are now forced to share school bathrooms with the boys. So what's happening is the girls refuse to drink water all day long. So they refuse to drink from the moment they get to school until the moment they get home because they don't want to have to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And then you think about, girls, preteens, teenagers who are experiencing periods for the first time, right?
Yeah.
And you think about these boys are actually now allowed by school policy to come into the bathrooms where they are. In Loudoun County in Virginia, here in the US, just this past fall, there was huge scandal in the news, and rightly so, because there was a boy who went into the girls' bathroom and very violently sexually assaulted a girl in that bathroom. But according to school policy, that boy was allowed to go in the bathroom in the first place.
Right. And you did see how that issue had a big impact on the governor's race, but things get very complicated, because everybody can get behind the idea that we live in a violent society and we need to protect women and girls. But how do you even have the conversation when many people are insisting that trans women are women, and for other people, trans women are simply men? So it gets complicated even linguistically to talk about. And I know that, women's organizations feel very comfortable talking about violence against women, but they are not so comfortable talking about what it means to be a woman.
Yeah, the dominant narrative among groups that claim to be feminist these days, as well as among many other groups, is they've got that repeated mantra that you just said, that trans women are women. And at WoLF, we try to be very accurate when we use language, because the gender ideology activists, I've found, very intentionally use complicated words, made up words. They conflate a lot of issues, because language has a lot of power. And, we've seen that mantra over and over, that trans women are women. And what at WoLF, we have a pretty science-based definition of what women are and what men are. We believe that human beings, there's only two sexes, male and female. There's a tiny minority of human beings who are born with a condition known as intersex. And there's still always going to be a male or a female, but they're born as an intersex male or an intersex female. And in addition to believing that there are only two sexes of the human species, we also believe that no matter how hard somebody tries, a human being cannot transform or transition or become the opposite sex. Mm-hmm. No matter how much a man might envy women for some reason, or become sexually aroused by the thought of being a woman, which is a whole thing, or for any reason that he really wants to be a woman, no matter what he does in terms of physically modifying his body, he's never actually going to transform into a female. And the opposite is true, right? So no matter how much a woman might want to be a man, and within a patriarchy where women are often violently targeted by men, we actually have a lot of stories of particularly young women who basically say, I wanted to live my life freely. I liked math and science. I wanted to be a tomboy, and therefore that meant I'm actually a boy. So there's a lot of trauma related issues to why we're seeing a lot of young women trying to transition over into becoming young men. But we just believe that, and to us, it seems so silly to be even having these conversations, right? That there are two sexes of human beings and you just can't transition into the other sex, no matter how much you want. So we use, instead of using phrases like trans women or trans men, we use a very specific phrase, which is trans identified male or trans identified female. So we're referring to a male, an adult human male, or a boy who has an identity of being transgender. But that helps us with that workaround psychologically. So we're able to describe this group of people, but not, conform to the language that they're using.
And I really appreciate your clarity about that, since so many organizations are afraid to speak out on this topic. So what has been the reaction since WoLF does take this strong position about there being two sexes and that they are not interchangeable?
Yeah, so we and I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about WoLF. So we've been around for a while. We were founded in 2013, got incorporated in 2016. We're a really tiny organization still. We were all volunteer run until a couple of years ago, and now we have 6 staff members for a national agency. So we're very small, but ever since we began, we've had this philosophical belief, this scientific belief that people cannot transition into the opposite sex.
And this was a belief that 5 minutes ago, everybody else held too.
You would think, although I can speak from my own personal experience of going back to.
I guess you were in academia, so maybe I'll take that.
Yes. Well, and when I was 18 at my first volunteer gig at a rape crisis center, we were being told about transgender identities. So that was, and I'm 39 now. So, that's a couple of decades ago. Wow. But yeah, so going back to the reactions that WoLF receives, we get hated on a lot. I gotta say, I'm really so grateful and proud of my board members and my staff members and the volunteers who are publicly affiliated with us, because we have some board and staff members who receive, rape threats and death threats, very, very serious threats against them. A lot of attempts at professionally smearing us. When I told a lot of colleagues that I was taking this position, they were all very privately supportive, but they were also worried about me. Like, what's that going to do to your career afterwards? Because you're going to take on, you're going to lead an organization that is saying this controversial idea that, human beings, we only have two sexes and you can't change your sex. So we get a lot of very angry comments from people, whether they're sending us emails. We had an event a couple of years ago, and there was rather a large protest in Seattle, where the Seattle police did end up having to arrest a few of the protesters and take them away because, they were indicating violence against WoLF's presenters. So whenever we plan an in-person event, we have to go through a lot of extra security precautions and plan out escape routes and talk to police and things like that. So it's really a significant issue of contention in this country and in many other countries now, where particularly when women speak out and say that they don't believe human beings can change sexes, women get targeted a lot with very vitriolic threats and comments. I'm sure you're familiar with doxing, right? Where people will try to gain access to, people's personal information and info about their family members. And it's fair to say that, some of our staff, board, and certainly supporters really have a lot of concerns about that, because they see the kinds of very violent comments that are hurled against us online and in person.
Have there ever been any overtures from other women's organizations who maybe take a different view, but who have reached out to say, we understand we have some differences, but we're all, trying to protect women from violence, and we do share some common goals?
I wish that would be so nice. Not to my knowledge. I can't think of any other major feminist groups that have extended a hand. Now, in all fairness, I will say, I would say we have sort of generally in a public way made it known that we'll work with any agency that has some shared interest areas. So that's actually on my to-do list this year, is specifically reaching out to the national anti-sexual violence and anti-domestic violence groups, because to ask them for their support of us as we pursue a lawsuit against the state of California. So last fall, we filed a lawsuit against California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, because California is one of several states across the country that now allows men to transfer into women's prisons, regardless of why those men were in prison in the first place. So we have convicted sex offenders and convicted murderers who are now literally in the same cells and in the same showers as female inmates. And my dissertation research was actually about the impact of sexual violence and domestic violence on the lives of incarcerated women. So I know the levels of trauma that these women in prison have already faced. And so what I've thought is very interesting, we have several, I think 5, 6, 7 states now that are now transferring men into women's prisons, which is obviously the opposite of being trauma informed, right? The opposite of trying to really prioritize women's safety. And what I have found very interesting and noticeable is the total silence from national victim advocacy groups on this issue. I haven't seen any kind of statement issued from any of the national women's groups or victim advocacy groups saying, wait a minute, the vast majority of women in prison are survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. We don't think it's trauma informed or a good idea at all to let men be in those cells with them. There's just been total silence.
I think so much of this has to do with what you were saying about there being so much fear around this issue. And I know you guys do a lot of work around women's sports and the impact this ideology as having. And one thing I found so disturbing with the story about the University of Pennsylvania women's swim team, when some of the swimmers wrote a letter saying they didn't feel it was fair to be competing against Leah Thomas, who just a few years back was competing as a man, I think as recently as 2019. But the letter was sent anonymously because the women were afraid for their future careers. And I just thought that says so much about where we are, that in 2022, college women are afraid to speak out and use their voice. And none of the big national feminist organizations have come to their defense after years and years of telling us how important it was for women to have a voice, which is really crazy because I suspect that most Americans agree that it's totally unfair for Leah Thomas to compete with women.
There's a lot of minimization when they do know, and they say, it's not really that big of a deal. And that's something I always think it's interesting to observe the sex of the people making comments. So, I'm on LinkedIn and I'll make a comment on LinkedIn. And typically the people who tell me I'm wrong, it's often men, and it's often very minimizing, like, why do you care so much anyway? It's not a big deal. So it's, but we also have a lot of women who have bought into this ideology completely, right? It's very much we actually sometimes will describe it as a religious belief or a faith-based belief, right? Because it's not based in science at all. It's based in someone's beliefs about female brains stuck in the wrong body or something like that. So a lot of people are very quick to bring out the arguments about, you're a bigot if you're saying this. And so I think for a lot of people, they're so afraid of being labeled as transphobic that they completely censor themselves and they don't speak up, even though they really disagree with it. So for example, when I was leaving my last job to come over here, when I started telling colleagues where I was going, I think I mentioned earlier, people were very excited, but also worried. But I thought it was so telling how many of my colleagues reached out to me privately to say, I'm so glad you're doing this. I love that organization you're going to go work for. But they felt as professional women, they could not ever express that sentiment publicly. And it's because they're so afraid of being labeled as a bigot and being fired from their job.
And this is what I have such an issue with, because for decades, we've heard the women's movement talk endlessly about the importance of empowering women. And here we are in 2022, and so many are afraid to speak up. It might as well be 1950.
And I will say, so it's complicated, right? So this is where my interest in that class analysis comes in, right? Where we do have a lot of women who, if they're relying on their paycheck and they've picked up on signals from their HR department that if they say something, they'll get fired, right? So it's so complicated because
that's true.
But then we think, but we know you all agree with us privately, but you're afraid of being fired. But if all of you came forward in a united front, you can't all be fired, right? Like maybe your employer will think twice about this. So there's a lot of some structural forces at work that keep people silent. But I think you're right. If we had more role models who had a lot of public influence, like for example, these coaches, right? Why aren't these coaches coming forward, both male and female coaches, saying, we know this isn't fair. We know there are fundamental biological differences in strength and speed
do know that.
And agility, but they're all staying quiet and they're all encouraging us to believe in that the whole emperor has no clothes storyline, right? Like when you look at an image of Leah, it's really obvious Leah is a male. There's no denying that Leah is a male, but we're all being told we have to eat up this narrative that Leah is actually a woman. And so for these young female athletes and students, you think about it, almost all of the authority figures in their lives are telling them that they need to believe in a lie and they need to repeat that lie.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Yeah, I think about as a society, basically all of us and, us grownups, we're basically telling young adults and children now that not only is it okay to believe in a lie, you should actually punish other people when they speak the truth.
From your position at WoLF, can you give me a quick overview of the areas you feel this ideology is having the biggest impact? I know you mentioned prisons before, and I know that's a big issue for your organization, especially given that so many women in prison have suffered sexual trauma. But what are some of the other areas?
So definitely protecting women and girls sports. So we really advocate for single sex sports and athletic competitions. And, we do a lot of work on all of these areas. We focus on submitting testimony, whether it's oral or written testimony, to get our arguments on the record for bills throughout the country. So, just the past couple of weeks, I think we've submitted testimony on, 10, 12 bills at this point, and they just keep coming up on all these gender ideology issues. And luckily, the single sex sports issue that has really seemed to have captured public attention now more and more. So we're really grateful that there are other groups out there as well focusing on that. So we work with some of our partner agencies. What we also really want to emphasize to people the importance of, for example, like domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters being single sex, and rape crisis support groups, right? Because again, statistically speaking, if a woman is seeking out shelter at a domestic violence agency, it's pretty likely that the perpetrator who has been hurting her is a man. And so she's going to be maybe psychologically re-traumatized if she has to go into a shelter space and sleep next to a man, maybe in the same room or just down the hall. And then, of course, perpetrators could then also pretend to be victims and come into that space, right? So we support other types of single sex spaces like that. Another issue that we are really deeply concerned about is the medicalization of children and teenagers in this country. And by medicalization, I mean healthcare providers encouraging and promoting and actually carrying out procedures on children and teenagers that are permanent and life-altering, and basically can sterilize these children and teenagers before they've even really had an opportunity to think about what fertility means to them or having children means to them. One of our partner agencies is called Partners for Ethical Care, PEC for short. And one of our advisory council members is one of the founders of that group. And so they do a lot of sort of investigative reporting and looking into these issues related to healthcare providers, including mental health professionals, counselors and therapists, who believe that gender affirming treatment is the only appropriate way to respond to a child or a teenager who says that he or she is trans or non-binary or something like that. And it's of extreme concern to us that there are so many clinics and healthcare providers in this country now who are making money off of these vulnerable children and vulnerable parents. And so we're really concerned about these kids and teenagers being sterilized or having just other types of permanent procedures done.
I just want to stop you there for a second, because I'm really glad you brought up this idea of affirming, because it really seems to have completely taken over the medical community, to the extent that if you do anything but affirm a child who is confused about their sex, the idea is that you're really putting them in danger. And even to question a child who's confused, as opposed to affirming them and encouraging them down the path of medical intervention, is seen as dangerous. But I'm wondering where the data is to support this view.
Well, that's a great question. And I'm someone, I always like to be able to cite my sources. And, years ago, I was hearing, these alarming statistics about, the majority of transgender people will die by suicide if they're not affirmed and if they aren't supported. And, they'll be suffering mentally and physically forever. And something that a lot of very well-meaning parents, right? They're just trying to be parents in these crazy times we live in. they are literally being told at this point by teachers and school administrators who have also been told this, that if you don't affirm your child in this way, your child will die by suicide. And it turns out when you try to actually track down the research on this, you can't actually really find a whole lot of information. You can't, if you think about the causation of dying by suicide, death by suicide is a very complex topic. If somebody is suicidal, that person might also be suffering from depression or anxiety or other serious mental health conditions, right? And so maybe one part of that person experiences they're also struggling with so-called gender dysphoria or something, or they're struggling with trauma, right? I was talking earlier about girls wanting to become boys to escape sexual trauma. So there's really no way you could even prove that somebody who didn't get gender affirmation treatment died by suicide as a result of not getting that treatment. What we do know is, there are some studies that show that, even if somebody goes through a bunch of surgeries and has hormone treatments, it turns out, not shockingly to me, that person still ends up having mental health struggles later on in their life. And I think, one of our many concerns about these medical interventions that are permanent for children and teenagers is that, well, first of all, there's the obvious fact, we don't let children or teenagers drink or smoke or get tattoos or vote or join the army. But apparently now we are supposed to tell them, if they think they're the opposite sex, we're going to go help them have surgery on their genitalia or get pumped full of puberty blockers so they never go through puberty in the first place.
And this is so interesting to me because it really goes against the established protocol for all other medical intervention, where patients are really encouraged to consider the risk carefully, seek second opinions, and really question whether the results will be worth it to them in the long run. But in this area, it's just the opposite, where if you question the treatment, puberty blockers, surgery, that's considered harmful.
Yeah, it's so, like you described, it's totally backwards from pretty much every other, I think, cultural idea we have in this country about what it means to be a good protective caregiver, right? Parent, grandparent, authority figure, teacher, coach, minister, right? As adults, we're always taught, treat children, you want to treat children with respect, you want to listen to them, but we're here as older and wiser people to help guide them down the path of life, right? To help them ask questions.
Right.
And in this case, what adults are being told is, don't ask the child any questions, just support the child no matter what this child is saying. And it's just, and you can kind of come up with so many ridiculous analogies.
Well, anybody who's had to live with teenagers understands that not all of their ideas are very good. And plus, we've all been teenagers. So, we understand that it's a very challenging time, and teenagers are very vulnerable.
And I think, so for WoLF, coming back to, we really focus on, we want to rid the world of gender ideology, right? We see these sex stereotypes about real men are like this and real women are like this. Those really harm everybody, right? Because just as human beings, we all have a variety of personality characteristics. We can all be loving sometimes, we all get angry sometimes, right? We can be strong some days and weak other days. And so what gender ideology does, though, particularly with these kids, is it's encouraging kids to believe in sex stereotypes and take it to the extreme. So, for parents who, let's say they have a little male child, and that little male child seems to be going through a phase where he wants to play with his sister's Barbie dolls, right? And toys and things like that. Why not just let the kid play with the Barbie dolls? That doesn't mean he's actually a girl who was born in the wrong body. It just means maybe for whatever reason, he's interested in playing with dolls.
Yeah. And as a child, I would find that so scary to have the adults around me asking, well, do you think that means you're really a boy? That would be terrifying. And I think the idea that we're so mutable, that we don't even know the most basic things about ourselves, that would have caused me a lot of anxiety as a young person.
Yeah. And, I would think it would really mess with children's minds. Particularly, it's interesting if, these children are being told what, if their family believes in a God, right? They're coming from a religious community, but then the messaging is, you were born in the wrong body. So if they're coming from a religion that teaches them that their God is all knowing and all powerful, is the message,
but sometimes
then
he makes
your
really
God
big mistakes. Yes.
your God made a mistake and put you in the wrong body. And now we're going to take you to the doctor and let the doctor fix that. I mean, it just blows my mind when you think about, as you said, the psychological impact that this is having on, really young children, tweens, teenagers, young adults, because so many of the authority figures in their lives are going along with this now for a wide variety of reasons. And I'm really concerned about what our society is going to be like in a couple of decades when all of this comes to a head.
Yeah, I share your deep concern about that. And I wonder, since we've seen such skyrocketing numbers of young women who want to transition, I wonder if eventually they will be the ones to lead us away from all of this, because they will understand how difficult it was. And I think they will have a lot of questions for the adults who guided them down this path.
Women's Liberation Front, we have a part on our website where people can send in anonymous stories. And one young woman, she's college age now, and she wrote into us to say, when she was in high school, she went to a summer camp. And at the beginning of the summer, there was just a bunch of normal girls at the summer camp. And at the end of the summer, so many of them had decided they were boys. And she saw how these girls who said they were boys got special attention and special treatment from the camp counselors. So the messaging was that you're not really special if you're a girl,
Right.
but if you say you're a boy, we're going to kind of welcome you in and give you all this extra support. And she said a few years after that, she was watching a documentary about cults. And she realized, oh my God, at the summer camp I was at, it was basically like a cult, right? Where all these children are being groomed and brought over. So it's really I think for the children, it's a social contagion. And for the adults, it's like this mass delusion that people are participating in.
It's very scary. And that's why I'm so grateful to your organization for speaking so clearly on this issue and providing at least a different take on all of this for people who are just searching for some answers, because I know there aren't many organizations like yours out there right now.
We are the only one in the United States, the only feminist, nonprofit, nonpartisan group doing this work. Like I said, we're pretty small staff, when you compare us to the other national feminist organizations out there, but we feel so strongly that we're really on the front lines of trying to protect women's very basic legal rights at this point.
So for people who are interested, can you give your website and maybe some contact information?
Yeah, sure. So our website is www.womensliberationfront.org. If you go online and look for us, if you just search for Women's Liberation Front WoLF, you'll be able to find us.
It's a great acronym, I have to say.
We do our best. Like I said, I'm proud of our staff and our board and our volunteers. And we're always open to people contacting us if they have ideas, if they want to volunteer, if they want to donate, of course, because particularly with the current political administration at the federal level, we obviously aren't going to be getting any government grants anytime soon. So we're basically supported solely by people's private donations. And so, like I said, we've got a staff of 6 and we're working at the national and state government level in every state. So we always appreciate support from people. If you go to the website, you can find all of our social media information as well. And to anyone who, any of your viewers who might be interested in getting involved, like as a board member, actually, we're going to be doing a recruitment for board members later this summer. And we would love to just get some new people on board to help us with leadership too.
Dr. Mahri Irvine, thank you so much for joining me. And thanks to all of you for watching this episode of Feminism and its Discontents. You can check out other episodes and other content at Firsthand Media DC. I'm Cecily Fiadh-Fernandez. Thanks for watching.